The Loop.
The Loop. You have the divine spark. The Loop.
Do or do not. There is no try.
The Loop.
Give me your word.
Hey there, this is Misha, and welcome to episode number 17 of The Loop, the podcast where I interview career coaches and experts on everything from practical job interview advice, offer negotiation tips, to finding more meaning at work, and much, much more. Today's guest is Stefania Montagna, and Stefania worked at Google for several years as a sales and biz dev manager. She also worked at the UN Development Program, a large media firm in Europe, and speaks 5 different languages fluently. She also has various certifications and training in yoga, mindfulness, psychology, and other embodied practices. The conversation today was super interesting and went in several directions that I did not expect. The plan was really to talk more about emotional intelligence and how this is important, why this is important in the workplace, but more specifically in the job interview, and why we sort of shy away from difficult questions about conflict, about failures, and what we can do to sort of overcome that. So this was sort of the plan for the conversation, which we did go over in detail, but it also went into other topics, into sort of the socio-cultural reasons this happens, how this is perhaps different today with cancel culture, and sort of this this tendency for people to blame each other at work, and all these sort of different controversies that are really more recent since the invention of social media. So that was a really fascinating conversation for me, and I loved hearing her perspective on it. But yeah, it was a good mix of, or it is a good mix of really practical advice going in for a job interview, as well as starting to think about some of these different topics around emotional intelligence, how to be more emotionally aware, and some steps and techniques that you can start today that Stefania also shares. So if any of that sounds interesting to you, then I think you're really going to enjoy today's conversation. Hey, Stefania, thanks for joining me.
Hello, nice to be here.
So we were chatting a little bit before I hit record, and one of the topics that you are very passionate about is this idea of emotional intelligence and why it's important at work and also in the interview process, which is an interesting idea that I hadn't really thought of until you brought it up. So I would love to get into that today. But before we do, I'm curious, like, why is this topic interesting for you? Where does the fascination or curiosity come from about emotional intelligence in general, and also with this like interview sort of angle?
Mm-hmm. Well, it's not too much to say that developing emotional intelligence has really changed my career, and I would even say my life. But without going into like the really deep transformation that I brought, what I can say is that I was at Google twice, right? The first time it was until 2015, and I had this manager who kept saying that I needed to develop presence. Now, presence is one of the attributes that Google really looks for, or at least it did back then. They've changed somewhat since, but I think the gist of it remains. Like, you have to have a certain level of presence at work, which involves things like not getting defensive, things like pushing for your ideas, but without getting angry, for example, and like basically managing your emotions. And he said this to me all the time. It was basically the entire motivation behind the fact that I would not be even suggested for a promotion, for example. But the concept of presence was really vague. Like, what does that even mean? I remember that every time he said that, I was just like, I'm here, am I not?
Yeah, it sounds like when you walk into a room, when I think of presence, like you walk into a room and people are like, "Hey, look at that person. They're they're confident, or like they're comfortable in their own skin, so they have this sort of, I don't know, presence or aura around them." That's what my image is when you said presence.
Right. And I think there's something to that. But that's not the only thing because, for example, I was not the person who was not known on my floor. I was very active. I was involved in some of the team meetings for the entire team, like with the rector. So it wasn't a question of not like of being transparent. It was more a question, I think, of owning your emotions, which is what emotional intelligence is very much about. And so, well, basically, on my last day, my manager, just as I was walking out the door, like it had to accompany me so I could hand in the badge and then go to the airport. And well, he gave me this book, which is Emotional Intelligence by Daniel Goleman. And
Classic.
right, exactly. And I read it and it really resonated. And then it got me onto a path, which I think was a path that I had already taken to a certain extent by starting to do some yoga and to do some meditation. But in the next years, I got more and more tools. I attended more and more trainings. And it really, really made a difference. To the point that there was a second instance. Now I was back in Google again. This was 2017, 2018. So I was hired again with the promise that I would be promoted really soon. And then this promotion didn't happen again. And that time, instead of just being really upset and angry, what I did was going back to my notebook and actually write down all of the things that I'd done in life that made me feel happy and accomplished, all the things that I was proud of. In 2017, I was hired by Google again, obviously after some more experience, which had, by the way, tested my emotional intelligence. But I think the real test came about a year later, because I was hired with this promise of a promotion that would come. And promotion season rolls around, and big surprise, I did not get the promotion. Which, had it happened some years before, I would just have been angry. And I mean, I was like really angry and upset when it did happen. But instead of, let's say, acting out, what I did was go back to my own notebook, my meditation practice, and a lot of that. And I wrote down that exact same day a list of all of the things that I was proud about, everything, like any single project that I had carried out in the course of my life, not just in my career, but also in volunteering experiences when I did sports and things like that. And the list helped me figure out what it was that was important to me, which was the idea of being a bridge. As in, for example, I speak 5 languages. So obviously, this idea of the bridge comes out really clearly there, because it's always been important for me to be the person that's able to speak to others in their language rather than have them translate their thoughts to me. So I really related with that, and I let that be my new mission at work. So instead of focusing so much on promotion and even the tangible goals that I was supposed to achieve, I tried to see all of the ways that I could bring my entire self into work. And that really completely changed who I was perceived as. I became much more, I think, able to do the things that matter to me, and I became a reference point for many of my colleagues when things got tough, not just in terms of reaching our targets, but actually dealing with difficult situations or conflicts inside the team, which of course there were, like there would be anywhere.
So it sounds like, just on that, so it sounds like there's a bit of like a couple things happened. So one is you had this manager boss, like on your first time at Google, who basically said that you needed to work on this presence, which you didn't really get at the time. It sounded like you sort of spoke to him about it, but it didn't like really sink in. And then you left, and then you came back, and then the second time around with the promotion that didn't happen, you're like, okay, what's going on? Who am I really? Like, what are my strengths? And then that sort of assessment or reassessment led you to uh, realize, what your strengths are, in this case being a bridge. And then that sort of turned into this sort of like bit of a paradox of intention situation, where you stop focusing on the goal and you just started focusing on your strengths and the team. And then in turn, I'm guessing the next part of the story is like you were able to get some promotion, or at least there was some
Exactly.
happy
Yes.
outcome. Yeah.
Indeed. So that did lead to a promotion, but it especially led to people seeing me the way I wanted to be seen, which is really with this ability to own the things that are hard and make them into a strength, instead of always being out looking for the things that we think define us, or something like that. I think that a lot of emotional intelligence is really about taking the difficult experiences and finding the gold in them. But society teaches us all of the time that we kind of have to go outside of ourselves and get new skills and get the certification, or achieve this outer goal. But actually, so much of achieving all these outer things means or implies getting at peace with the things we have actually already received. So it's not so much looking for new things that we need, it's more finding the gold in the things that we already have. That would be my nutshell summary of what emotional intelligence really is about.
Right. Yeah. So unpack that a little bit more. So like in your example, if you were, or when you were thinking about this idea of presence or emotional intelligence, you were perhaps looking for something externally, or like something that was that you're supposed to do, or something that was expected of you, and that was maybe what you thought was the right action or the right path, but then actually that wasn't the right thing to do.
Exactly. So I think at the time I was really concerned with trying to live up to the company culture in a very specific way, trying to influence and come with some ideas that I had, which I was really convinced were right. Let's say we were to do or like to roll out a certain strategy for my region, I would be very adamant about getting my point heard, and perhaps even get upset when it wasn't heard. So a lot of it was about recognition, which is, I think, the flip side of presence. If you don't have presence, you're lacking recognition, by definition, because you're not really feeling or being seen. But I think here what's interesting is to actually unpack emotional intelligence as it is defined by Goleman, because he basically has 4 components that he highlights. The first one would be self-awareness. So self-awareness, as it relates to any work situation, and particularly to an interview, is being aware of what is happening in the body and in the mind in the moment that it is happening. And I think there's a wonderful metaphor for this, which is the radio station. So, if you have a radio and you find a radio that you like, let's say Radio Happiness, you think that that's the only radio that's playing in the room. But we all know that's not true. The moment you turn the switch, you can find a completely different radio. All of the radio frequencies are there at the same time. This is another way of saying. but we get to decide which radio frequency to tune into. So the same happens in our brain. We have a lot of thoughts, the 90,000, whatever number of thoughts that we have per day. And I think that when we have little emotional intelligence, or at least I can speak for myself, at the time I did not have a lot of it, I believed a lot of my thoughts. Thoughts like, this is unfair, or I am trying so hard, why is no one seeing this, and other things like that. But those thoughts don't have to be the truth. So if we are self-aware, we're able to see that we have a thought or that we have a feeling. Like, for example, the feeling of injustice might appear in the body in the form of a really tight chest, or perhaps like a burning stomach. Well, self-awareness is observing that. So that's the first step. And then we have the second step, which would be self-management. So once I am self-aware, I can decide how to deal with the thoughts and feelings in a way that's more constructive, versus when I am not self-aware, where I just act based on whatever it seems, or whatever I think is going on, right? So self-management is the second part. And then there's empathy, which is that switch from me to we, whereby I'm able to relate to the other person, not from the perspective of how I would feel if I was in that person's situation, but rather from the perspective of trying to understand how that person is feeling from their viewpoint. And now the last one would be the management of social situations. So finally being able to relate to a lot of people, keeping in mind all of the ones that came before.
That's a lot, right? Like
It is.
I think the first one is actually the hardest, in my opinion, because it's that you need some sort of trigger point or some sort of event for you to realize that's even a possibility, right? The possibility of being self-aware, to even be able to understand that idea of like, oh yes, I am being actually very reactive and I'm not paying attention to actually what's going on in my body, in my mind, and then from that point starting to actually notice it and reflect on it, and then the other steps come after that. But just that initial self-awareness is so difficult in any situation. So I wonder, like in your experience, like you mentioned, you do yoga, meditation, so I think that's a big part of that. But I wonder, have you seen any, or do you have any ideas around this, or have you seen any other examples of like how can you create this sort of trigger for people, or how can you create this self-awareness if you just have no idea? Like if I'm listening to this and I have no idea what you're talking about, and I'm like, oh, that sounds really great. How do I do that? Right? How do I even feel that?
Right. I don't want to seem like too obvious, but I do really think that practicing meditation is the best way to get into that. But one really good way of seeing whether that is happening is to take a look at how often in your life you're triggered. So particularly if in a regular day at work, you get triggered, let's say even 5 times, then something is going on. Because the fact is that the more external triggers we have, the more it means that we're attributing what is happening to us to what is happening outside of us. And for example, recently I was working with a client who shared that she was having an issue with getting defensive during job interviews, especially with probing questions. Now, for anybody who's listening to this podcast and who's preparing an interview with the likes of Google, Facebook, Amazon, and so forth, probing questions are not like a part of the game. They're the main ingredient, basically, I would say. Probing questions are not an attempt of catching people in a mistake. They are literally the tool used in order to understand how people think, and especially interview candidates. So if a probing question makes you feel defensive or get defensive, that is because underneath there is a sense of there's something wrong with me. And it's important to understand that it's not that the probing question is a trigger, is that the person is experiencing it as a trigger. So whenever we find ourselves in a situation where, a colleague asking for something is a trigger, and then our manager asking for clarification is a trigger, and then a reorg is a trigger. And a reorg is often a trigger, that's fine. But, let's say you get a new task and that's a trigger, and then somebody else has a half an hour delay on a delivery, that's a trigger. Like if everything is a trigger, then you need to go and explore your self-awareness and your self-management.
Yeah.
Because there's a story there that you're believing.
Yeah, no, I mean, and the example you were just giving, you're like, if this is a trigger, if that's a trigger, is like, I just imagine this person like just going throughout their day, just like freaking out at everything, and just like chill the fuck out, just like calm down. But it happens so much, and it's happened to me a lot when I was working full time, and it just made me think of more recently. I think this is more of like a social work issue that's happening recently, where people are sort of getting triggered and calling people out and canceling them, and sort of people are getting fired or just in trouble, I guess, for saying certain things. But I wonder how much of that just comes back to that person, right? They're just it's the same sort of trigger.
Yeah, there is that very interesting book, The Coddling of the American Mind, which talks about this a lot, about younger generations not having that muscle of actually accepting as a reality, not as triggering. Because the point is that being triggered is not a hero place. You're not in a position to change things when you're triggered all of the time. And I am saying this because I was that person. During the very first, I don't know, almost at least 6 to 7 years of my career, everything was triggering to me. And that did not allow me to have an impact, particularly not the type of impact that I wanted to have, and which I believe that most people want to have, which is positive, uplifting, and building of new things and new approaches. But you can't do that if you're feeling constantly attacked.
Yeah, absolutely. It's the bigger question there is, well, why are you being triggered, and what is the motivation behind you saying anything at all, right? And so if the motivation is some positive change or something to improve the product or to improve the team, that's one thing. But oftentimes it's not for that purpose. It's really more of a complaint, or it's more about just expressing that emotion without really having any constructive motivation for expressing it, which is healthy in some instances and situations, but not 20 times a day.
No, exactly. And I think a lot of it is also wanting to be right, which is something that especially social media has overemphasized, because it thrives on polarization. So there's a lot of I'm right, you're wrong. And that isn't the way that conduces to more participation. In fact, it leads to the outcome that you mentioned, which is cancellation culture. But cancellation culture doesn't really allow us to meet the other person where they're at, and thereby to create that wonderful cocktail which comes from participation and inclusion. Now, there's a sentence by Rumi which says, there's a field beyond right and wrong. I'll meet you there, which really refers to this idea of meeting another not with the idea of context, but with the idea of me owning all of the experiences that I've had, and this other person owning all of the experiences that they've had, and us together, creating something new, which is not rooted in trying to overcome the other in any kind of way, but actually meeting with, our scars, not necessarily our wounds, but at least the scars, right?
Yeah, not just a battle between right or wrong, and it's very nuanced, right? Like the reality is very nuanced, and like you said, social media makes it very black and white, and that's had this sort of trickle down effect on just the workplace, and yeah, people act that way.
Yeah, exactly. And to bring it down to the realm of interviewing.
Yeah. We jumped into a deep topic, and so let's talk about interviewing a bit more, and like how this is related. Yeah.
Exactly, but because this is truly related to interviewing, even though a lot of candidates might not realize that and might not have that at the forefront of their mind. Because what I find is that, especially with Google has GCA questions, which are cognitive ability questions, and I believe most other companies do as well. And there is a real sense that candidates have that they must have the right question, or sorry, the right answer to either of those questions, which is not at all what they're intended for, because those questions are inherently difficult. So a typical question there is, imagine that you're tasked with entering a new market as the sales guy. How do you go about it? Frankly, anybody who's worked in sales knows that this is not an easy question, because it's not an easy thing to do. So there are lots of ways that one could go about it. And what I find is that candidates are really, really keen on trying to think about it. They always want to get, they want to get the question simplified. Like a lot of them are like, okay, so where is this product already being sold, or do we already have a marketing department for that product, which is not the goal of the interviewer when asking this question. The goal of the interviewer is to know how the person is thinking. So the more you ask clarifying and restricting questions to make the question less complicated, you're actually signaling to the interviewer this intention to be right, which when you're working for a company that's at the forefront of technology, which all of the FANG companies are, you there's no guarantee you're going to be right. And actually, what you can see, seeing the products that have already been developed, is they all have an aspect of being extremely useful, extremely successful, extremely used by the largest number of people that have ever used the product before. And yet there are downsides to those products and those services. So it's really not a question of being right. It's a question of thinking critically.
For sure.
And
yeah.
I think critically and you think critically, we might not get to the same answer, and hopefully we will not, right? Otherwise, what's the point?
Yeah, for sure. And I think this has been echoed. I've interviewed a few people on this podcast who've been at Google and Amazon. I think they've echoed something similar, where I think Phil said that he was an engineer at Google. He said, hypothetically, you could get all the answers wrong in the technical interview, like going through this problem and trying to solve this engineering problem. But because you've thought it through so well, and your logic is very clear and your assumptions are clear and you ask clarifying questions, you could still get the job, right? And so the whole point is that it's not about getting the right answer, and really, like you said, about the thinking process. So why is this so difficult? Why do people get defensive then? Why do people not ask these questions? What are they afraid of?
Well, so I have this theory, which ultimately links it back to belonging.
Okay.
So there's something I did this morning, just as a thought exercise, which was to review a few of the constitutions of European countries. Because there is a fact that I know, for example, from the Italian constitution, I'm from Italy, And it is that, in its Article 1, which is usually devoted to establishing the form of state, it says Italy is a republic based on its workforce or based on work. And there is a real sense whereby for people, work and thereby interviewing for a job is directly related to belonging. And basically, I don't want to jump too quickly, so bear with me here. But if you think about it, work is related to money, and money is an idea. It's completely an idea that we all agree with. There's absolutely nobody disputing the idea of money, but that's the idea that facilitates an exchange. So through money, we participate. If I have a job, I'm able to, I don't know, write for a magazine, or I'm able to do some sales and meet some people that are working for another company, or I could be selling bread, or it doesn't matter. But whatever I'm doing, I am participating. This is an idea of the Industrial Revolution. It was not like that before. Before, you could very well not have an economic role and still be considered part of society. But in our society today, there is no other way of participating except for doing some volunteering, which you can do, but you still need to support yourself.
Or being a monk.
So, right, exactly. But I mean, you still go back to that thing of, okay, how are you going to support yourself? Because there is no safety net in most of the world. So in that sense, when we are in an interview situation, what we're playing with is our ability to exchange with others. And thereby we're playing with the idea of belonging. Now, what is belonging? Belonging is that belief that if I'm left alone in the woods, somebody will come and get me. So for our amygdala, belonging is fundamental to survival. That's why it is so triggering to be in an interview, because it feels not like we're tested for, the role at Google or the role at Facebook or the role at X, but that we're being tested for our very ability to be members of society, which ultimately goes back to the question, like, why are we here on planet Earth? And why did I deserve to be born? Like, we can go very, very deep with this question. But I think that is the ultimate trigger that we obviously do not think about, because what we're thinking about is, oh my God, it would be great to, be in that role, or I would love to have that salary, or whatever it is that we tell ourselves.
Yeah, it's pretty, it's implicit that this is going to be like a new home for you, and that's I mean, you want to say the right things, and there's a lot at stake. The stakes are very, very high. So I think that makes a lot of sense. And I wonder, maybe another angle there is, or maybe curious to hear what you think about this, is how it relates to the power dynamic and maybe childhood and your parents. Because I feel like oftentimes you're going in and there's like this boss or like this person in charge, and they're sort of asking you questions, and there does feel like a power dynamic oftentimes, right? It's like they're, your potential job and future and salaries in their hands. So like belonging coupled with that, you could be a good boy or a good girl, or a bad boy or a bad girl sort of feeling, probably doesn't bring out the best in us always.
Exactly. And look, I had a client that I worked with. And one thing that came up in our coaching there was around the fact that he needed, the manager to always approve beforehand. So this is, I think, something that a lot of us will recognize themselves in. This need for approval before we act, or this fear of acting without approval and thereby screwing things up and then being fired. So this was the issue. And so I asked, okay, so show me where, like, first of all, who's the voice inside your head which you relate to this. And I always give the option, like, is it mom or dad? Because there are not that many other options usually. And so in that case, it was the mother. And then I asked, okay, like, where is she sitting in the room? So this is a really effective way of seeing, like, where you're placing your parents in a room. Like, if you put yourself at the center and try to see exactly, like, where do you place them while you're working? And it turned out that this person was placing the mother just a little bit ahead of them in a chair, like looking in their direction. So 45-degree angle, which is a really good way of being checked. Right? Like, if I'm at 45-degree angle from you, you take a step, I can hold you back.
Yeah.
And interestingly, according to, for example, the theory of family constellations, the mother and the father are behind us. Because that's the only way that we can go forward. Like, if I have somebody standing in front of me, I'm never gonna go my way.
Yeah.
So they really need to be at the back, and I think there's a lot of that comes up in interviewing, especially with the idea of transfer. So if another way of thinking about this is, mothers and fathers have all type of styles. So somebody might have grown up with really authoritarian parents. Somebody else might have grown up with the really libertarian parents, like parents that allowed you to do anything. What happens when you find that style in the interview room and when you find the opposite style in the interview room? Because very often what you will do, however subconsciously, and again, we go back to self-awareness and self-management, is to project the things that you longed for and that you might not have gotten. So the authoritarian manager might be the authoritarian parent that gave you really, really straightforward rules, but perhaps hugged you one time too little. So it's interesting, definitely, to go down that route, though I think that the best way to do that would be to even consider therapy with a psychotherapist or psychologist.
Yeah, absolutely right. And we all have different different childhood backgrounds and experiences and everything. So it's hard to say exactly. You can sort of stereotype some archetypes around that, but really it just depends on the individual. But the point is that this is probably a bigger factor in the interview than you think, right? You're taking in all your emotional baggage from your past that you haven't resolved, and you're putting yourself in a situation where you're not necessarily desperate, but there's a lot on the line, and you're potentially in a situation with a character who could be triggering you. And if you don't know how to deal with that sort of situation, then you're probably just going to default into whatever habit patterns that you've developed over time.
Yeah, exactly. That's why I would definitely recommend to people to try and be open and even perhaps undertake several interviewing, paths at the same time, so that instead of hanging it all onto this one job that has to be the right one, like I always tell people that it's a little bit like dating. And if you're really just trying to fit the one person in front of you to your molds, it seldom will happen. But if you're actually going in with the idea of really trying to feel like, is this job or is this person or is this job the right job for me, then you're much more in feeling mode. So again, we go back to that self-awareness that comes up if you give yourself 3 or 4 options and just accept that the right job might take some time to roll around. Sometimes that position hasn't even been created yet. And that there's not so much pushing that we can do all the time. Sometimes it's really about resting in knowing that we don't know. And that, I think, is something that can make you a much stronger interview candidate, because you're not as attached to the end result, and you're much more in feeling mode. So again, we go back to that self-awareness that as you are to experiencing the process to its fullest, as an evaluation for yourself of what you could get out of this job, what you could get out of these potential relationships with, your new hiring manager, potential colleagues, and all of that with the company. It really puts you in a much stronger position, I think.
Yeah, for sure. So I think some of what you said, to be like being more aware, self-aware, and that is really key, obviously, in life and in our conversation and work and the job interview. And a lot of that takes time and work and self-discovery and all that. But is there anything that you could do right now? Like, let's say you have a job interview coming up in the next couple of weeks or multiple interviews. You don't have too much time to go through all of your childhood traumas and triggers, but you still care deeply about these companies. You're very interested in these roles, perhaps. So what kind of advice or tactics do you have to sort of navigate so some of these tough questions and expectations that come out?
Mm-hmm. So I have one exercise which I really recommend to everybody, which basically recommends taking a look at the experiences over a meaningful period of time related to this particular role you're going into. So this is important. Don't necessarily take all of your life, and do not just take the last year. But let's say you have, 5 years of experience, and they're all in retail, and that you're applying for a tech role, which is somewhat loosely related to retail. Take the last 5 years, right? So that you have enough juice there. And then the idea would be to make a list of all of the moments that marked a before and after. And if you can do this in a circular pattern, the better, because I want you to see how often the same issue has come up in different shapes or form.
So what do you mean? So like circular pattern of, are you listing out your achievements or your issues? Like, what do you mean?
No, you're marking the moments that marked a before and after, which is not your achievements, because a before and after could be a new manager came on board. That's nothing to do with you, but it might have marked a before and after because suddenly, maybe you didn't have such a great relationship with the manager that was there before, and then the new manager comes along and you get a much better relationship, or vice versa.
So it's like some pivot point in your career. It could be like a new manager. It could be moving into a new role. It could be like what else? What other examples could be pivot points?
Well, it could be, the moment you had this really big project, even within like your existing role, the moment you were, let's say, the first time you decided to help a colleague that you had some ideas about, and that you found out like were not really the right ones, or you revisited. It could be stuff like I've talked about, such as you expected to get a promotion but you didn't, or you didn't expect to get a promotion but you did. Reorgs, like basically anything, or suddenly you were given a new client was really intimidating for you, or this new colleague came along that became a really good mentor. Like anything that marked the before and after.
Okay.
We all have this, and I think people will instinctively know what are some moments for them. And so what you want to do is to write down the moments, and also write down the feelings that were attached to this particular moment, and some of the decisions that you took about yourself or about life in that moment. So, for example, let's take the example of a change of role in terms of a reorg, because I think people don't know this, but in tech companies,
it's quite relevant right now also.
Right.
Yeah.
Well, I mean, it's very relevant, and also in tech companies, they happen all of the time. So it's best to know this. And it very much feels like something outside of us. And so what happens during a reorg is that, your compensation plan might be changed, or suddenly your role might be completely changed. You're in a new team, you have a new manager. Like, there's a lot of consequences there. And the interesting thing is what you decide right there and then that this says about you. So, for instance, if you have the thought of, oh, like, I'm always the unlucky one, and you find that through several of your pivot moments, then that's something to be aware of, that you have that narrative that shapes a little bit the way you're interacting at work.
So it's asking a question. So just to stop you there. So it's like at that point, you could look at all these before and after moments and just sort of look at them and be like, oh, okay, these things happen, and still not really be self aware of the patterns and what connects to all these points, right? So maybe there's some questions that you ask yourself about
Yeah,
these, right?
definitely, because as long as you're just listing out the things, you might think, you just keep having those same thoughts that you had. Like, let's say that you're the person that thinks they're working really hard and not getting recognized, and then you do this exercise, and that's just going to reinforce that thought, which is not at all what we're after. What we're after is to try and take stock of the decisions you've taken. Like, the moment the reorg happened, that same person might think, oh my God, I'm gonna have to work twice as hard to get that promotion that I was waiting for, because now I'm at the end. Like, we all build up all those stories where we might think, oh my God, now I'm the most junior person in the team, and in the team I was in just before, I was the most experienced. Right? That's one way of thinking about it. The interesting thing is that same person with emotional intelligence might have thought, oh, wow, I'm the most junior person in this team, which means I've been doing a great job, and I'm going to have all of these mentors, and I'm going to grow even faster than I was growing before. Right? So I really want people to see that there are different alternatives to interpretation. And what you want to list out is, what are the interpretation that you had in the moment? What's your interpretation today? And what are the lessons you learned going through that? Because as you do this, what you will get is, first of all, a really comprehensive list of all of those stories that you want for your interviews. You're going to get all of your conflicts. You're going to get, the project that was really difficult, and the failure, and, all of the things that you're going to be asked for. But also, you're going to start seeing some of the patterns that you go through, as well as many of the lessons that you have already gathered. And that's the thing that makes you strong in an interview. If you know that you've already walked all of that road, basically what you understand is that, okay, now it's like the really steep 100 meters path up, but you've already walked, I don't know, 15 kilometers. So it's not the 100 meters that are going to be so challenging. And that's something that I think can make you much stronger, much more confident interview candidate, because you know where you're coming from.
Absolutely, yeah. I love that exercise. I haven't heard of that before, and I think that's definitely worth doing for any interview, because when I look at especially big tech companies, you have to prepare so much and prepare a little bit differently for each one as well, and depending on the role. And oftentimes, you're thinking of sort of examples just based on questions you think you're going to be asked, like, oh, accomplishment or failure, or using data, or whatever. And so you're just sort of cherry picking these examples based on information you found online, and there's really no cohesive narrative. You're not really thinking about your career as a whole. Maybe you're going through your resume or something with a recruiter, but you're not really going really deep like you're describing in this exercise. So I think just even from the point of like remembering this stuff, it's going to be a lot easier to remember the highlights and what you were doing if you actually think about it this way the before and after, because we think more in stories, right? And it's not in terms of like resumes and like random examples.
No, exactly. And I think, I mean, this comes up, as you say, really clearly whenever I ask people, like the tell me about yourself question. Most people want to start their interview coaching with that.
Okay.
And I prefer to leave it to the end, because the fact is, if you don't know which stories you're going to tell, your tell me about yourself is going to be an idea of yourself. And what I find is that people bring in stories from their childhood that they are not able to live up with their examples. They can also bring up, strengths assessments, things like, whatever. I'm really communicative. And then none of their stories talk about how they used communications to solve an issue. It's all about logic, for example. You want to make sure that the tell me about yourself question is rooted in the stories you're going to tell afterwards, because then you're believable. But if you tell me at the beginning of the interview, I'm really strategic, and then I'm like, well, okay, so tell me about the time you used strategy to inform this one project, and you say, so what I did was to collect all of my colleagues around the table and get the best ideas. You're not strategic in that way. What you are is that you're great at tapping other people's wisdom, which are both great things to be, but it's just that your narrative is not matching them.
Yeah. So it's I think, like you're saying, people are nervous about that question, and it's important for them. And perhaps the reason they're nervous about it is because they don't have the clarity in their own minds around what story they're telling. And so once they actually figure out the different stories and their own narrative, then it's easy to come up with a little summary of that, rather than trying to do it the other way around, because it's going to be a lot harder to dig out, and it's probably going to change as you explore your history and background. So I think that's very powerful advice, actually. And I think a lot of people probably make that mistake. So yeah, how is it on the other side of the table? So as an interviewer, are are interviewers asking specific questions around emotional intelligence, or is it just is it even part of the interview process? Like, for example, at Google, how is that assessed, and how does this conversation all play into that?
Well, basically, all of the behavioral and hypothetical questions are already testing for that. So there is no particular need to ask specific questions around emotional intelligence. But if you think about it, a question like, tell me about a time you had a conflict with a colleague and how you handled that, is actually tapping into that. And what I find is that emotional intelligence actually comes through, or actually I should say the lack thereof, comes through in much more subtle ways in the way a candidate answers anything. So let's talk about fears for a second, because I find that a lot of the time when I'm working with interview candidates, they are really reluctant to talk about conflict. They're really reluctant to talk about failure. They're really reluctant to talk about difficulties of any kind.
Yeah.
So you ask them a question about a conflict, right?
Yeah.
And you ask a question about conflict, and all of a sudden you're getting an answer which is like, and I made the client super happy. And I'm like, okay, where was the conflict here? Right? So there's a lot of conflict avoidance. But even more, there are those tendencies to try and make themselves into the best possible employee ever throughout your entire work history. So one example of this, I had a candidate who was going to tell me a success story with a client. And the first thing he said was, so once I inherited this account, the client was really unhappy, but it was because they had another account manager before. And that seems innocent, doesn't it? But ultimately, there's a finger pointing there. There's a fear of admitting that an account that you had, or like a client that you had, was not happy, which I think is interesting, because if everything was always flowing fantastically in the world, first of all, we might not live in the planet that we live in, but there would not be so much need for customer service and, like roles like that, where inherently what we're trying to do is to fix issues for people that are not happy. Like it's just a fact of life. So to say that you have an unhappy client per se doesn't disqualify you as a potential employee. But the fact that you need to tell me, it wasn't my fault, is actually pointing to an embarrassment that you might not have been the best employee at the time. And I think this goes back to owning the experiences that you've had, and to that exercise that we were talking about. Because if you look at your career history, you will notice that on day one on the job, whatever job, you were not the world's best employee, or at least I wasn't. And I think most people are not on their first day. So to imagine that all of your stories have to be about you being the world's best employee is a bit of a fictional and frankly quite boring story. That's not what the interviewer is after. The interviewer wants to know, given the stories where you did screw up, what did you do at the time? But most importantly, what would you do differently today if given the chance? And by undermining the conflict, the failure, the difficulty that you had back then, you're not able to admit and own up to what you did back then that you wouldn't do today. So you're not able to own up to the lesson, and you're coming across as a really plain candidate. Basically, I mean, this is the equivalent of coming into the interview with a refrain, and that refrain might be, I'm the world's best salesperson, or I'm so customer service oriented that I will never let a customer down. And you're just rehearsing that the entire interview. And that doesn't allow the interviewer to actually feel your depth, get some of the insights on those cards that you have that are going to be really fundamental in informing your next steps once you are faced with a difficulty. Because I'm just gonna close with this, but the reality is that working for a tech company is really challenging. There are all of the times really difficult, potentially difficult and hard decisions that you need to make with little information. So if you're afraid of failing, then you're not going to be the best decision maker in those circumstances.
Yeah, absolutely, and it all ties back to sort of what you were saying before about, well, why are people not sharing those failures? And maybe part of it is they don't normally do that in their work, but surely they've had those experiences, and partly it can be just because of this fear of going to the interview and trying to impress, and this need for belonging, and some of these trigger points we were talking about. So I think it's really interesting to keep that in mind, and then maybe as you do this exercise that you suggested, that can be really helpful to really paint that story, build that narrative, and then I guess maybe give you some more confidence going in, that you're able to share those unique sort of perspectives that you've gained over time, and that it's not just like right or wrong answer. It's like, this is actually my story, and you can draw on that.
Yeah, exactly. And I mean, it's always going to be the things that were a little bit hard and that we've overcome that make us unique, more than the happy days sipping mojitos on the beach. Very few stories are about that.
So. Yeah, I was sipping my mojito on the beach, and then got a phone call, and that's where the story starts. That's pretty funny. Okay, so There's a lot of different questions I have there. I mean, I know we're coming up on time here in a few minutes, but I was wondering like how I wonder how this is different now versus 20 or 30 or 40 years ago. Like I wonder if going into an interview, and I don't have any data or anything really on this, but I just wonder if those expectations have changed from both sides, and are people coming in more reserved now, trying to impress, or was that more the case in the past, or maybe it hasn't really changed, maybe it's always been the same?
Well, good question. And to be honest, I don't know either, but I would think that, again, a big factor is the influence of social media, especially on the millennial and future generations, in terms of, we've learned to project our lives outwards with those really fantastic pictures and,
Yeah.
beautiful landscapes. And I remember a couple of weeks back, I was reviewing my Facebook feed from 2012 for a project that I'm working on. And, the thing that really caught my eye was that if I looked at my newsfeed, it looked like all of my friends were either travel agents or culture gurus. There was like nothing in between, right? And that was 2012. I think it's even worse now, personally. Um, and so we've learned to really put out this super polished, super perfect image. You can see it even on LinkedIn, for example, where there is, at least in my feed, if anybody knows how to optimize for something else, please let me know, in between parentheses. But what I see are a lot of so-called heroes' journeys where, we have this character that initially suffered some kind of difficulty, but now is the world's most successful. And the really important thing is, LinkedIn is a professional network, and I find really few people writing stuff like, okay, I am trying to optimize, my sales process. Does anybody have any tips? Which would be a really useful question to ask.
Yeah.
And I'm sure that would lead to a lot more interesting answers than Mr. X that interviewed this pregnant woman and then decided to hire them to make the company seems like the best company in the world. But just to mention like one of the
Yeah.
stories I saw recently. There is a lot of trying to just show how we've already reached perfection. There's less
For sure.
owning of the struggle, which I want to make this really clear. It doesn't mean that you should go into the interview talking about your wounds and started to cry about, the one time your manager told you that your presentation was awful. It's not about acting out the sadness or the anger or whatever, but it is about recognizing that when it comes to many of the questions you're going to be asked, you're necessarily not today where you were some years ago. And I think there's one very easy culture shift to take into account to compare where we were 30, 40 years ago versus today. So diversity and inclusion, that's the very easy example. If you ask somebody, what was your policy on diversity even 10 years ago? And that person says, oh, I was already very aware of my biases and already, I hired people with a different whatever. That's just not going to sound true because the focus on diversity might have started 10 years ago, but it was really, at least as far as I remember, it was fairly marginal at that time. Today, it's something that is really important. So if you're asked a question about how do you include people in an interview today, and you bring up an example from 15 years ago when you built a really diverse team, you better have some really hard data to show that. What might be more interesting could be to say something along the lines of how you screwed up in the past and how you're becoming more aware of this. I know, for example, that that I wasn't for sure as informed about diversity and inclusion today, or like in the past as I am today. And I've worked in really international contexts, including, for example, in Benin, at the United Nations. And I really own up today to how I did not do a great job at the time connecting with my colleagues because of cultural differences. But I can't go back and change the past, but I can own that and say that today I would try to do better.
Yeah, yeah, absolutely. And it, like you were talking about the sales guy or the customer service person that comes in and sort of like beating their chest and it's like, I'm the best salesperson, I'm the best customer service person. But obviously, if that's true, then you must have gone through a lot of crap to get to that point. You must have seen a lot and been rejected a lot and had a lot of tough conversations. So you better be talking about those and explaining how your journey has got you to this point. But yeah, the conversation around LinkedIn is really interesting. I think we could have even a separate podcast about that, just because it is different in many ways in the interview, right? Because it's social media, and there's less at stake, but then there's more at stake socially and in other ways, and it's a little bit complicated. But I do see the same thing that you've mentioned, where a lot of people, you're just not going to see a lot of vulnerability on social media, or especially on LinkedIn, because it's a very professional network. So the recent example is just all the layoffs happening, and then you see so many like messages of joy, like, oh, I was laid off, but my CEO is great, I wish him all the best and on to the next step of my journey. And it's like, dude, like, you had to move across the country with your family. You're obviously pissed off and angry and frustrated, and this is not a good thing, and maybe the company could have done it a different way, but none of that is really part of the conversation, because many reasons, right? Is you're posting this on social media, you want to get a job, like, you don't want to be too vulnerable or be seen as complaining. So there's just so many factors, I think, that go into putting that out publicly versus maybe privately in a one-on-one setting. But yeah, I see that a lot too, and I'm like, I don't know how to think or feel about it, but it is frustrating. Like, there's no way these people are all just hitting home runs every day. So
No, exactly. And I think this goes also back to the idea of positivity, which is, for example, a very common misconception about googliness. Like, whenever, like, I've seen this happen a few times with new hires inside Google, thinking that googliness is all about positivity all of the time and about partying all of the time and about being out there all the time. I mean, in other words, being an extrovert, which is not what it is about. Like, googliness as a culture is much more about the fact that we're all contributing to the same bigger mission. So how can you be of help? How can you collaborate? How can you yeah, honestly, I think the collaboration piece for me is the most important, but it's also about like the going above and beyond, being humble. Like that's the fundamental one, which goes back to not knowing the right answer to those interview questions, because if you're humble, you're not always going to know everything. So it's much more about that than it is about jumping on the party bandwagon every time it rolls around, which it does fairly often, like maybe even too often. But it's not that that's going to make you googly in the real sense, whereby other colleagues are going to appreciate you as much as being the person that's there to listen whenever somebody is going through a difficult moment, or that can pick up the slack if your colleague is overworked. Like that's much more what it is about. But again, it gets packaged into this idea of positivity. And again, there are a few books that can be recommended around that. I remember reading one, it was some years ago, but it was about the idea of toxic positivity. So being positive means seeing the positive also in the things that are hard, but it doesn't mean not seeing the hardness in the things that are hard.
right, it's a realistic sort of positivity or optimism, whatever you want to call it. Yeah, not just being blindly positive. So yeah, it goes back to the conversation about the interview, and you don't want to just spin everything into a positive light. although you can have those lessons learned. And obviously, if you just have example after example where you're just failing constantly, then that is also a red flag, of course. But having one or two or three examples amidst your many stories where you're truly, reflecting on, hey, like I didn't do a good job here, or like, we lost money, or we lost a teammate, or I messed up, and like those are things that we should be able to admit, as obvious and simple as it sounds. Perhaps it's not as obvious as you would think. So
No, that's true. But interestingly, I mean, one thing is also the universe keeps throwing at us exactly the same lessons to learn over and over again. And I find the universe is really, like, whatever, if you want to call it, differently, I like to refer to it as the universe. It's really generous. So the same lessons come back again and again and again. And that's why it's also interesting to do that exercise, because what you'll find is that, oh, here's that lesson that I was supposed to learn that one day. And here's that lesson again that I hadn't fully learned. So we go through the layers of an onion, and we just keep learning those same lessons in deeper and deeper ways, because we all have some things that we have to work on, but that number of things isn't actually so huge. For somebody it's going to be about humbleness, and for some other people it's going to be how to stop and actually look at the person in front of you. But nobody's going to have 150 lessons to learn and another person too. I think they're very equally distributed. And what tends to happen is that we find them again and again and again. Like, for example, you find out with people who tend to trust others too much, that they trust the one person and then they get, let's say they get screwed, and then they trust another person again, and the same happens. And in that case, it's about them not having the boundary to actually see whether or not the person can be trusted, and that's the lesson that they have to learn.
Yeah, for sure.
For me personally, one of the lessons that I keep having to work with really relates to humbleness, with being at the right level. For example,
what do you mean being at the right level?
Well, so there is this fantastic article by Cheryl Strayed that explains this wonderfully, and it's called "Write Like a Motherfucker." I'm quoting, and it's great. You can find it online, so it's easy to find, and it's also in Tiny Beautiful Things. That is one of Cheryl Strayed's books, and what she talks about is the fact that humbleness is very much about being on the ground. The reason for it is that etymologically, the word humble comes from humus, not humus, the food, but humus, the substance in the ground just below the earth. It's one of the first strata in the grass, or like in the earth. And so basically it's the one that you're working with if you're farming, right? Like if you're planting seeds, you're gonna be with your hands inside the humus. And so humbleness is about letting go a little bit of the idea of being grandiose and of being the best of whatever there is, but also letting go of the idea that you need to self-deprecate. So humbleness is really finding yourself at that level where you're neither too high or too low. And I personally find that this can be related a little bit again to your upbringing. For example, it can be a lot harder to do if you were a parentified child, or it can be very hard to do if your parents always did everything for you, because then you're not going to be at the ground level, you're going to be way down, right? Because you always need somebody else to do things for you. So these are ways of thinking about it. But I find again and again that going back to this ground level is the way to actually get real work done. So a typical example is, in preparation for this podcast, I I tried to put together my notes and see like everybody that I wanted to reference and think about, everything that I wanted to bring on board. And then there was like this really strong voice saying, "Oh my God, what if it sucks?" Right? Like, as in, what if you suck? And the fact is that going back to the exercise, which is saying, okay, I'm going to write down everything that matters to me on this particular topic, was the thing that allowed me to go back to that ground level. Obviously, knowing that if you had interviewed Daniel Goleman about emotional intelligence, you might have had a much more, research, sophisticated, and informed viewpoint. But I can be me at the ground level, and this is what I can contribute to this audience today. So this is one way of thinking about it.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. And for the record, I do not think you suck. I think that this has been a very interesting conversation. So, like, you came well prepared, and it really showed in the conversation. So I appreciate that.
Thanks.
Yeah. So I think we covered a lot, and maybe it's a good time to talk a little bit more about some of the coaching that you're doing, because we got pretty deep into some of these topics, and obviously it can get much deeper in individually with people who are interviewing or going through something in their work lives that they'd like to improve and gain some more sort of self-awareness. So tell me more a little bit about the coaching that you do, and like what kind of things, what kind of clients you work with, like what kind of tactics you use, and a little bit more about that.
Yeah, sure. So I do two kinds of coaching. One is interview focused, and the second one is leadership focused. My leadership coaching really focuses on bringing along these aspects of emotional intelligence, both in order to succeed better at work, but also to find more balance in your life, be more aligned with your mission, be happier, basically. And I mean happier not from the perspective of laughing all the time, but to being a bit more open to the things that happen. Because to happy has the same origin etymologically as to happen. So to be happy is to be really ready for things to happen and welcome them. So that's something that I work with. Now, when it comes to interviewing, I've been experimenting with bringing more of this approach to emotional intelligence into the interview coaching, because so there is a catch-22 with the interview coaching, and that's the fact that a lot of people think of getting a coach just like a few days before they have their interview, which is not ideal. So if you're listening to this podcast and you're thinking of interviewing in 6 months, I would suggest you get a coach now. It's way better to start earlier than to be under pressure and have to research a company's values, understand, the role you're preparing for, and then prepare all of your stories and review your CV and all of that. It's just overwhelming. But a lot of what I do is for interviews specifically is to actually do mock interviews where I'm asking people to first come up with a story, and I time them. I try to see how they're building up, the situation and the tasks and all of that. But I especially pay attention to how they're building up the stakes. So going back to what we said about, people being conflict avoidant, what I very often look out for is, okay, is this person building the conflict like, either there are two subjects having different goals, or is it that it's two subjects having the same goal, but different views of how to get there? And if that's missing, that's one thing I would point out, because there's no conflict unless you have one of these two. There has to be something to lose in a conflict, otherwise there's no stakes. So I look very much for that, and then I basically try to help them rebuild the story with a more story-oriented narrative. So that's one approach. But then I figured that this wasn't enough, because what happened was that people come with too few stories. They also tend to want to make the story bigger or smaller based on the framework.
Mhm.
So I always insist on like trying to share the stakes, but you don't have to increase the stakes in any ways. You just have to be more aware of where exactly you were when that happened and why was it really a conflict. So what I've been trying to do and what I've been doing more is to actually guide people through some of the some of the situations that they're going to be probed for in an interview, and to do the probing so that they can find the lessons. So one example of this is, let's say that the question is about one time you hired and did a bad hire. So this is a question that will come up for people that are applying for people management positions. And instead of having them go through, okay, I hired this person and, whatever happened, I try to ask them things like, walk me through what are the obstacles that this person found in their path and what you did in order to remove them. And this might seem like a simple question, but it really gives you the information straight away of where that person was in their management journey at the time. Because I've had a candidate say that, or admit that they actually didn't think about the obstacles for that person in that position, and thereby they didn't remove them. Mm-hmm. And so this becomes much more a story of how you were a manager than a story of the bad hire you had. Because the problem is that, of course, the interviewer wants to hear your thought process and things like that. But when the question is phrased as, tell me about the time you made a bad hire, candidates might have a tendency to go into why that person wasn't a right fit for the role and not think too much about their own responsibility. Mm-hmm. And I always want to help people go back to what's their responsibility in all of the stories that they're telling.
Yeah. So it's these. What one is like the first approach sounds like sort of time sensitive when someone has an interview coming up, and you can really just get into the weeds pretty quickly and help them out. And then the other is not necessarily just interviews, but just careers in general, like really picking apart some of these stories and narratives and getting a bit deeper and developing them and understanding them. So they both sound very powerful and could be done in combination depending on the time and the individual.
Yeah, exactly. And this is why I really think that the more time candidates have to prepare, the more they're able to go deeper and use interviewing as an opportunity for growth, which is actually, if you think about it, it's a tremendous opportunity, because that's the moment you're also going to be in a salary negotiation. So obviously, if you're able to present yourself as somebody who really owns their career up to now, it's much easier to get the slightly higher level, that higher salary from the get-go, instead of moving as you tend to do laterally at the same level and maybe get 10% bump or something, but then you have to start from scratch again. And going back to what we were saying before, given that the number of lessons to be learned usually tends to be something that is very recurrent, use this opportunity as a growth opportunity and as a way of really owning those lessons and seeing a bit further ahead or further beyond just the stories that you're telling, and see what they're telling you about yourself. So we go back to self-awareness.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, there's another thought I had. I feel like we could just keep talking because there's so much stuff here, but I think we wrap up here in a minute. But you mentioned something about repeating mistakes, and that sort of caught my ear, because I think there's a lot of these cliches that we hear, or they get stuck in our heads, right? Like, apple a day keeps a doctor away, or like, don't make the same mistake twice. But I think there's, you're approaching it with a little bit more kindness, and also just you're more realistic. Like, yeah, like we are going to make the same mistake more than once, and it happens a lot, and let's just admit that happens, right? And
Yeah, exactly.
yeah.
I mean, that, again, I think it goes back to this humbleness principle in terms of going back to the ground, because what I find is that we either let ourselves off the hook completely, like in the example with the bad hire. Oh, I hired a person that wasn't good for this position, instead of like what I could have done as a manager in order to help them feel good in that position. But we also don't want to go down into the fixed mindset of this is who I am and I cannot change. Being at the ground level means that we're going to be generous with ourselves whenever we see that we're on, layer 10 of the same onion, which like usually has exactly the same flavor as layer 1. And we can have that generosity of saying, okay, here we go again. But I also already have gone through all of those 9 previous layers. So I know that this is coming up again. And so how can I manage this? So again, the first step is self-awareness. The second is self-management. So can I approach this not with anger or sadness or a feeling of injustice, but just like, okay, this is, the thing that is on my path and that I really need to look at. And there's a lot to learn from here. Because if I have learned from the 9 previous layers, then I'm going to know that there's something to learn also in layer 10.
Yeah, absolutely. So do you find that when people are sort of uncovering that in some of your coaching, for example, are they like, do you see any sort of like big change in just like a few weeks? Is it really clear how their sort of stories have evolved, or is it something that you think takes a lot longer that's not apparent until maybe, maybe a bit longer down the line?
So I think the insight actually is planted right in the moment. So people usually have like this big realization of, oh wow, to actually witness a change, it does take a little bit more. That's why I mean, especially for leadership coaching, I prefer to work over 6 months periods because I think that's the time it takes.
Yeah. Yeah, absolutely. It reminded me of a time. I don't remember the conversation, but this is maybe a few months ago, someone was saying something. I might have been talking about my business, and then I reacted in some way, and then their reaction was, "Oh, you don't have to be defensive about it." And I was like, "I'm not being defensive. You're being defensive." And so then I caught myself. I was like, "Oh, wait, maybe I am being defensive. What's going on?" And then in the moment, it's hard to like unravel it, and unless that person's really open to talk about it. And then later on, I was like, oh yeah, I reacted to this because they were sort of questioning my business or questioning what I was doing, and I felt threatened because whatever, blah blah blah. So I think, yeah, it can be hard to do it in the moment, which is, it's nice to talk to people about it, like with a coach or a therapist or whoever, where you can actually reflect on those things and then sort of unpack them a bit, and sort of see why perhaps you did something. And it doesn't have to go all the way back to your childhood too, right? I think we talked a little bit about that, but it can be something more recent, right? It could just simply be you had you were rushed in the morning, or you haven't gone to the gym in a week, and so like internally you're not feeling good. And so like, there's all these different reasons you could have a trigger. It doesn't have to necessarily go as deep as we were talking, right? There's different layers, there's different levels of it, there's different time frames. But yeah, so I think there's many possible reasons.
Yeah, exactly. And this is why I really insist on the subject of things being recurrent, because there is a big difference. If something is triggering only once in a blue moon, then that's not a big issue. But if something is triggering all of the time, then that's something to be looked at. And I very much agree with you. It's not something that you can unpack right the moment it happens, because then your amygdala is hijacked, among other reasons. So you're not in a position to do that. But once your system has calmed down, that's when you can actually do some analysis. And for instance, I would always argue with first of all, sleep on it and then journal in the morning to try and see what exactly it is about. And always journal with the view of being in a conversation with yourself and of letting out those voices that are telling a story that you don't necessarily need to believe. So it's just write it down, because that's one voice, but it doesn't have to be you. Like, it's the non-identification part that is really important.
Yeah, I feel like you could do some different types of coaching here. I'm just throwing that out here because you've got this interview career coaching stuff, but I think a lot of these are quite relevant, just like life skills, and also how you're showing up in your relationship or how you're showing up at work, regardless of whether you're going into an interview or not. So I feel like you could definitely help people with that in different contexts. If you don't already,
I'm exploring some options,
Cool.
especially in terms of trainings
Cool.
and things like that.
Awesome.
So we'll see. To be continued.
Awesome. Well, I think this is a good spot to finish things up. I really enjoyed the conversation. I didn't really know where it was going to go, so I'm happy that we were able to explore all these different topics, and I'd love to get into some of these topics again, and would love to have you on again if you're interested. And I'll link back, of course, to your coach profile and everything. If people want to talk to you, they can do that. And I want to thank you for your time.
Yeah, thank you very much. It was a pleasure for me too. I so enjoyed the conversation. And if anybody has questions, please do reach out to me on the Kairos profile. I'll be happy to answer. Also, just if there's anything about the podcast or something I said which caught your attention, just it would be nice to hear about it.
Awesome. Thanks, Stefania. Alrighty. That about wraps it up for today. So I hope you enjoyed that conversation with Stefania. I really had a good time. I learned a lot, and I think there's so much we went over there. Some of it got pretty deep, and I definitely this is like the longest podcast episode I've had. Actually, it's like an hour and a half long, but I feel like I felt like I could have talked to her for even longer. So really want to have her back on and explore some more of these topics soon. But if what she said, if what we were talking about connected with you, and you want to perhaps explore this idea of self-awareness, of how this could be stopping you from doing your best at work or maybe in a job interview, then I obviously recommend that you speak to Stefania. She does the interview coaching stuff, like she said, but she also has just sort of more general emotional intelligence training and coaching for anyone that's interested. So I will link back to her profile in the show notes, so you can chat with her there, book a call with her. Also, some of the links that she mentioned in the podcast are also in the show notes, along with some other links that she sent me after the call. So check out those resources to get a bit deeper into this topic. And if you enjoyed this episode, if you have any questions, comments, feedback, then I'd love to hear from you. You can drop me an email. My email's in the show notes. Or if it's on YouTube, you can just leave a comment. And I hope to hope to hear your thoughts on this, because I really enjoyed this one. So that's about it for me. So I will let you go now, and I'm gonna go grab some dinner. So have a good rest of the day, and I will see you next time.